So, nice bowl of popcorn, good snack, filled with starch. Can't eat it too much though, because it does have a lot of calories. Now, a calorie is a unit of energy. It's just a measurement of how much energy I can get out of each little piece of this popcorn here. And through the process of cellular respiration, my body's going to oxidize the starch in this in order to release that energy and produce ATP, which we've talked about before. There's another way that we can release the energy, though, and that is through another kind of oxidative process, another type of oxidation reaction. See, fire just requires a little bit of activation energy, like any good metabolic process, the right elements, a fuel source, the popcorn, and ambient oxygen, like we have out here in the air. All I need is a little bit of a spark, and the same energy that fuels my cells is now giving me a nice toasty fire. Now imagine that that process is taking place in every single one of your cells every day. Something to think about. So, we've talked about metabolism as a general idea, the difference between anabolism, taking small starting molecules and building them up into, say, large polymers or large finished products at the end. Photosynthesis was kind of our special anabolic process that we talked about, where the starting materials were carbon dioxide and water, and the finished product was glucose. Well, G3P at the end of the Calvin cycle, but if you take 2G3P, you link them together, you can get a glucose out of that. So we'll say glucose was that finished product. Now, we also have to talk about catabolic processes, which is where you take a large starting product and you break it down into smaller constituents. The classic catabolic process we're going to reference is cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, organic molecules are going to be reacted with oxygen at the cellular level. We're going to use a lot of enzymes to get that done. It's going to be a slow step-by-step process, a metabolic pathway. Reactants to products to reactants to products, reactants to products, on the way down the line. Ultimately, we're going to take any given organic molecule, say glucose. Glucose is the example we'll use. C6H12O6. And we're going to react it with oxygen. And what we're going to get out the other side is CO2 and H2O. But in that process, right, kind of behind the scenes here, we're also going to make ATP, the energy currency of the cell. You guys remember ATP from the metabolism side. It's come up a few times this year. We've talked about ATP. It's a nucleoside coenzyme. The difference between ATP and a regular single RNA molecule is that it has 3 phosphate groups. Those negatively charged groups really want to get away from each other, so it ends up having a lot of potential energy stored up inside those bonds, and that energy, that chemical potential energy, can be transferred over to enzymes and proteins that need to be able to do their work. They need to be able to do their job. You put an ATP in, and you get the enzyme to do its job one time, whether that job is enzymatic processes, breaking something down or building it up, whether it's exerting your muscles, whether it's carrying materials around your body, transporting ions from one side of the cell membrane to the other. ATP has a wide variety of different uses. Now, cellular respiration, usually people see that respiration, they think that what we're going to talk about is just your lungs, breathing oxygen into your lungs. Maybe the circulatory system will be involved, and then we're going to talk about breathing out carbon dioxide. And there, I've learned everything I need to know about cellular respiration. That's regular respiration, taking in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Now, the two processes are related. Cellular respiration is describing what your body cells end up doing with that oxygen at the cellular level. How it is that we are actually taking that oxygen and using it for something. Because what we're using it for is to unleash the energy from inside these organic molecules. Oxygen is a very reactive element. We've seen it before. Remember when we were talking about water and I talked about how strongly oxygen pulls on those electrons? Well, because that same electronegativity, that same tendency to react with other molecules, it is a really aggressive element to work with, and you can unleash a lot of energy using the power of oxygen. And to demonstrate that, I have this starting image right here, which is a piece of paper that says calories, and we've set it on fire, so we're burning calories, right? Not only is that a nice visual pun, but it is actually literally true. A calorie is just a measurement of energy. So if you go to the back of a cereal box label and it says, you know, this is for 100 grams of this, it's 50 calories or something like that. What it's saying is that's how much energy that your cells could potentially maybe get out of that food when you go through the process of cellular respiration. And ultimately, what do you need for fire? You need some sort of organic fuel, say wood, and wood is made out of what? Mostly cellulose, and cellulose is made out of glucose here, so wood's basically made out of sugar. And you need oxygen, right? If there's no oxygen going to your flame, it's not going to keep burning. That's why if you have like a little candle snuffer, you can put that over the flame and it'll go out because there's no oxygen going up to it. Or how you can get oxygen consumed by having a flame inside of a confined space. So fire consumes organic material using oxygen, and then it releases energy. In this case, right down here, this is energy in the form of light and heat. But our bodies do something very similar. I mean, we don't glow. Well, we do infrared. We do have some black body radiation, but we do definitely produce heat. And all of that body heat that we have, it comes from our cellular respiration, the release of energy. Inside our cells, we also have these organic molecules coming in, and we also breathe in oxygen, and we are reacting them together in just the same way. In fact, the products are the same. When you burn a flame, you get CO2 and H2O coming out the other side, carbon dioxide and water. When I run a 5K, something like that, I am breathing out carbon dioxide and water on a constant basis. So chemically, you can actually see how much energy, how much power there is inside of a glucose molecule by setting something on fire and seeing exactly what that looks like. Now, if our cells released energy from our food at the exact same rate as burning this piece of paper right here, then we would spontaneously combust as a result. That's how powerful oxygen really is. So fortunately, what our bodies do is they put the molecules through a series of steps, step by step by step, one little enzyme at a time, trying to change the molecule this way and that way to slowly siphon off bits of energy and put it into other molecules. The molecule that's going to be storing that energy for us is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP gets the name the energy currency of the cell. The energy currency. So that's a pretty good analogy actually to use for how this process works. If you go into a store, you want to buy a pack of gum, and you got $100 bill, you're crazy, right? Like, no one wants to take a $100 bill and sell you a pack of gum like that. It's too big. It's too big for the purpose to which you would like to turn it. Similarly, glucose contains entirely too much chemical energy to be used to just power a single protein most of the time. What we got to do is we got to make change. You got to break that 100 into ones and smaller units, 5s, 10s, whatever it happens to be. ATP is that smaller unit. It's a form of chemical currency. It's a coenzyme, an energy carrier around the cell that is able to be used to power a single protein to do its job one time. A single enzyme, your muscle proteins, they all need ATP in order to get enough energy to change their shape, and when they change their shape, they do their job. So that's the purpose of cellular respiration. Now, You can break cellular respiration up into two different categories. You have aerobic cellular respiration, which is what I've been talking about, but there's also anaerobic cellular respiration. And actually, all organisms do some form of anaerobic cellular respiration. For a large portion of Earth's evolutionary history, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. The oxygen accumulated because of the activity of photosynthetic organisms, taking in CO2, bringing up water from their roots, pumping out that oxygen. So when oxygen, this extremely reactive molecule, started building up, it would be like if chlorine gas started building up in our atmosphere today, right? It would be anathema to most organisms on the planet. They would not be able to survive in an environment like that. And we ended up having a large die-off of organisms across the planet once O2 was building up in the atmosphere. However, some organisms, our ancestors, managed to be able to deal with this oxygen, and some of them even thrived in oxygen because it's so powerful, you can get a lot more energy out of it. So, some anaerobic organisms, those that do not use oxygen, did survive. We'll take a look at them. And the chemical process, the metabolic pathway for anaerobic respiration, still exists today inside our own cells. It's the first step of cellular respiration. But we now have a series of extra steps that involve oxygen and allow us to get a lot more energy out of our molecules. So, talking about aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Some organisms still are obligate anaerobes. Obligate anaerobes, what's an obligation? You have to do something. So obligate anaerobes have to live without oxygen. They can't deal with oxygen. They have to live in spaces like, for example, your small intestine, where you wouldn't have a lot of interaction with the atmosphere on a regular basis. Things like Clostridium botulinum, you would get growing inside of cans that were improperly sealed. So that you have this bacteria thriving in this anaerobic environment of this can, and then you can accidentally eat a bunch of botulism toxin when you eventually do open it up, because they're an anaerobic organism. Okay, tetanus, Clostridium tetani, is another anaerobic organism that you might be familiar with. It wants to get into that area, that puncture wound that you get, because once it gets inside, then it doesn't have to deal with all of the nasty oxygen that's out and around here. Now, the first step of cellular respiration is anaerobic. So, step 1. Glycolysis. Glycolysis. This step is anaerobic. This step is anaerobic. Means that no oxygen is required. And your mitochondria only do the portions of cellular respiration that really have to do with interacting with oxygen, only the aerobic portions. So glycolysis doesn't happen in your mitochondria. Glycolysis actually happens in the cytosol of the cell just outside of your mitochondria. Glucose, at the beginning, you can tell because the word glyco, the prefix glyco, is in here. And whenever you see glyco, you can assume that sugar is involved, and we're going to use glucose as our representative monosaccharide, our single sugar here for this process. Then there's this suffix here, lysis, and we've seen that word a lot this semester. We saw that red blood cells placed in a hypotonic environment, right, they lyse, they take on water till they pop. We saw that if you want to break a polymer apart, you want to start breaking it down, you need a hydrolysis reaction, hydrolysis, to break with water. You saw in photosynthesis, photolysis, right? The first thing that happens in the light-dependent reactions is photolysis, where we use the energy of sunlight in order to split apart water molecules, in order to harvest their electrons so that we can keep the electron transport chain going. So glycolysis is to break sugar, to break glucose open. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to take glucose and we're going to break it into two pyruvate molecules. This is starting to sound a little biochemistry here for me, but here's the quick version. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, C6H12O6. Boop, boop, boop. 6-carbon chain. Pyruvates are 3-carbon molecules. Okay, so we broke it. We took that glucose and we snapped it in half. Photosynthesis is all about making sugars. Cellular respiration is all about breaking sugars. And step 1, we are going to break it. Now, I make it seem like it's all one step, but actually there's 10 or 12 different steps along the way to go from glucose over to pyruvate, and a lot of different enzymes that are involved. Once glycolysis is complete, we're going to need to move on to the next series of processes. Those next series are aerobic. So they use oxygen. But glycolysis is an anaerobic process. Okay, no oxygen required. Now I'm not going to go into the details of every single step right here. This is just kind of give you kind of a roadmap of what cellular respiration looks like. Step 2. Well, now we're using oxygen and we have these pyruvate molecules. Step 2 is pyruvate oxidation. Sometimes this is also referred to as the transition reaction. The reason is because after glycolysis, we have these molecules. Glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria. Then these two pyruvate transition into the mitochondria, and immediately they get oxidized. So before anything else even happens, oxygen assaults. It just clobbers these pyruvates, oxidizes them, creates some CO2. But we also get a little bit of energy out of that process as well. Next, in photosynthesis, we have the Calvin cycle. So you're familiar with this idea that products enter a cycle and then they get changed by enzymes, changed by enzymes, changed by enzymes, and eventually some product leaves this cycle, but the rest of the material goes back to restart the cycle over and over again. In photosynthesis, it was the Calvin cycle. In cellular respiration, it's the Krebs cycle. Okay, we're going to need more oxygen in this process. We're going to create more CO2. And we're going to stash all of the energy from the glucose into two coenzymes. We're going to make NADH. That should sound slightly familiar. We used NADPH in photosynthesis. This is NADH. I remember that the P stands for photosynthesis. I mean, it doesn't, but the P for plants, P for photosynthesis is a good mnemonic to have. The other one is called FADH2. These are two different nucleoside coenzymes, kind of like ATP. They are dinucleotides, and they just carry a little bit of energy around. They carry energy here in these little hydrogen groups at the end. They've been reduced, which means that they have become reducing agents. Oxidation reduction is a bit like the game of tag. Once you're reduced, you can go reduce something else. Finally, all of the glucose is gone at this point. All of the carbons that came in for glucose, they have leached off over time here. All of them are gone. They've left the system as CO2. So we got the glucose in, we broke it down, right? C6H12O6 plus 6O2. We used oxygen. in order to slough off some more of this carbon dioxide. And now we need to get that energy into ATP, because right now it's in these two molecules, NADH and FADH2. So what we're going to do is use something called oxidative phosphorylation. In photosynthesis, we had photophosphorylation. You might remember this in the light-dependent reactions, where the cytochrome complex is filling up the thylakoid, the lumen, with all of these hydrogens, all of this positive charge there. And since that energy originally came from that captured sunlight, right? We capture that energy, we call it photophosphorylation, when ATP is being produced in that process. So phosphorylation, we're adding a phosphate group onto another coenzyme, ADP, and we're making ATP out of it. It's called oxidative phosphorylation because we are using the power of oxygen. We're using oxygen's greed for electrons in order to force it through, in order to power all of these processes below this line right here. So we're going to get into some more detail coming up.